I'm very glad to introduce in our university my colleague Lars Elleström, Professor of Comparative Literature for the Linnaeus University of Sweden, and Director of the Center of Multimodal Studies, and President of the International Society for Intermediate Studies.
Right.
He's our guest in the SemioLab and in the Hellenic Semiotic Society. We are very glad to introduce you here and to have it as a guest in Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. It is his first time he visits Thessaloniki, and I'm very glad to have it among us.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me properly when I speak like this? Great. So I'm happy to be here, and thank you for coming. As you recently heard, I work a lot with areas such as multimodality and intermediality, and for me, semiotics is one of the key tools to work with, to be able to stand how media work and how interrelations of media can be conceptualized. So if you ask me if I am a semiotician, I say, well, yes and no, because I'm not a semiotician of the kind that masters all the theories and work with all kinds of ideas and teach about everything. I have certain knowledge of certain areas of semiotics, and especially Peirce's semiotics, which I find extremely helpful in many ways. So when I use semiotic tools, thinking about how meaning is created through signification, I always do it with a specific goal in my mind, and that is to understand most broadly communication, and within communication, how different kinds of communication interrelate in various ways. So that is where I'm always going. And that is also the plan, so to speak, behind today's talk that I call Coherence and Truthfulness in Communication. And as it's a rather complex area, and as I work with rather many levels, distinctions, concepts, and so forth, I will mainly read the presentation to you with the aid of a PowerPoint in order not to miss too much, because if I skip a few links, many things will be rather incomprehensible, I'm afraid. So please bear with me having my eyes quite a lot in the text. It will take around 45 minutes, and depending on how we feel, if we are tired or exhausted or too bored simply, I can stop a little bit in advance. If not, I can go until the bitter end. For me, I hope to get comments, questions, suggestions, ideas, so I really look forward a lot to a discussion afterwards. And during that discussion, you can ask about this presentation here, or also if you have questions or ideas about these more general issues of communication at large, or intermediality or multimodality or whatever. So please free to simply talk about that if you think that today's topic is not what you want to talk about, really. So I suggest that while I do this presentation, you are very welcome to ask, well, let's say brief questions, right? So if there's something that, no, this you have to explain again. This is necessary to explain in order to be able to follow. So please interrupt me. Perhaps you could keep an eye on the audience so that we can do that. And more, well, big questions, general questions, more complex questions, we can take that afterwards. So clarifications during the presentation and discussion afterwards. Okay, great. So after having destroyed part of your equipment here, don't touch the lamp. We have managed to make the PowerPoint work smoothly. So how can truthfulness in all kinds of human communication be conceptualized so that it may be methodically investigated? This is the fundamental epistemological research question of this paper. Existing research in the area primarily examines how certain verbal propositions do or do not correspond to already known actual circumstances. These philosophical treatises are mainly based on logical aspects of language that are determined by a particular use of symbols, understood as habitual signs. Although interesting in themselves, no doubt, such investigations say nothing about how truthfulness is actually established by communication. This requires a focus on another kind of science, indices, which connect to objects not on the basis of habits or conventions, but on contiguity or real connections. It furthermore requires attention to all kinds of communicative media, not only those involving language. Media products, according to my definition, are those intermediate bodily or non-bodily material entities with semiotic capacities that make transfer of cognitive import among human minds possible through representation. Media products thus act as collections of material signs that make it possible to share mental signs, mental objects, sorry. So the aim of this paper is to construct a model that shows in which ways human communication may actually put us in contact with what we perceive to be the surrounding world through indices. A conceptual framework to be used for analyzing truthfulness in actual, complex, and often multimodal communication. It should be valid for all media types, news reports, photographs, testimonies, novels, songs, chats, even caresses, scientific diagrams, you name it. My approach will hence be semiotic, using some of Charles Sanders Peirce's foundational conceptions and his notion of the index as a starting point. But please note, not his own philosophical ideas about reality and truth. That's quite another matter that I will not delve into at all. So my next move will therefore be to take a closer look at Peirce's notion of index. I will then present my central distinction between what I call intracommunicational and extracommunicational domains. After that, I will suggest a foundational catalog of different kinds of contiguity. It will then be time for charting varieties of internal coherence and external truthfulness. And in addition, the central notion of communicating minds will be scrutinized in the light of the developed conceptual framework. Perhaps I will skip this. We'll see. And perhaps I'll skip this too. We'll see. Finally, I will perhaps then briefly criticize the notions of fictionality and fiction in favor of a more nuanced conception of extracommunicational indexicality, or what I call external truthfulness. So in order to be able to develop the model, a few basic semiotic notions derived from Peirce must thus be clarified, and I presume that most of you are quite familiar with these things, but I will nevertheless, just to be sure, because people sometimes understand Peirce in little different ways, so I'll present the Peirce foundational notions as I understand them right. So he basically distinguishes between three sign constituents, right? A representamen stands for an object in some respect and thus, quote, creates in the mind of some person an interpretant. Signs are, importantly, not static items, but dynamical functions constituted by entirely relational constituents, existing only in interaction with each other and driven by mental activity. So if you take away one of these three constituents, the whole sign collapses, so to speak. They only exist in interrelation as processes. And as you know, Peirce furthermore differs between three sign types characterized by their respective grounds. That is, how is the representamen related to the object? How come that they are interconnected? What is the ground of this interconnection? These three different kinds of sign defined on three different kinds of grounds are then, as you know, icons based on similarity, indices based on contiguity, and symbols based on habits. So the index is the semiotic backbone of this investigation here today. And as a rule, Peirce emphasizes a physical cause and effect relation between representamen and object. He thus argues that photographs are not only icons but also indices, since they are, quote, produced under such circumstances that they are physically forced to correspond point by point to nature, end quote. Yeah. I said icon, but sure, symbol too. Yeah. So that is, I think, one of the most important things of how to understand these three sign types, that they always exist together somehow. So I think that the main point is that certain signification moments may be more or less strongly dominated by a certain kind of signs. Sorry?
It has to do with the moment.
Well, yeah.
No, my question is, how can they be both? And I can't truly understand how can it be both. And if it has to do with the moment, maybe the time is a different dimension that changes that.
Yeah, it can be, because the signs are always, well, more or less, well, created, so to speak, by the perceiver, by some thinking mind. But
so it has to do with the interpreter.
It has a lot to do with that, sure. But in the kind of in the situation of communication, where we perceive something from outside, what I call the media product, of course, also the traits of the medium, the media product, affects how we conceptualize. So it's always something that happens between something being out there that we perceive, so to speak.
So it can be both.
And sometimes the traits of the media product, they determine rather strongly what is possible to understand and perceive. Sometimes we more freely think and interpret, so to speak, and then it leans more towards the activity of the perceiver.
Thank you.
And the point then by most people, when I think about photography as a kind of communication, as a kind of media product, it's not only dominated by one sign type, but most people think that there are two sign types that are salient, right? So a normal photography taken with a phone or something of our friends, so we perceive a similarity, and hence, oh, this is my wife, or this is my friend, or this is my son, because we perceive the similarity, right? But it's not the kind of similarity that you can perceive, well, let's say, if we perceive a painting of those persons. Because in the case of photography, we also know that the way the photo is produced is because actual physical processes out there, like the radiation of light, photons and so forth, have affected the photo in such a way that there's a real connection. So that makes indexicality also very, very salient in photography. All right, good. Now, so Percy's example here is then a real connection, contiguity in the case of photography, created by physical forces. And that's one possibility. But likewise, he also writes about symptoms of diseases as what he says then, signs which become such by virtue of being really connected with their objects. Okay, so that was another kind of physical contiguity. But although Peirce repeatedly emphasizes that the ground of an index consists of a real connection, it's clear that the notion of indexicality goes beyond the real, understood solely in physical terms. He also highlights non-physical connections and clearly states that indices do not have exclusive reference to objects of experience. And that, quote, it makes no difference whether the connection between representamen and object is natural or artificial or merely mental. And I think this or merely mental is very important here, because we cannot understand indexicality as being only about physical material interaction. It has also got to do with mental connections, interactions. So the mental realm must also be understood as real. Right? We perceive something, understand something, and communicate things through our minds. And also these experiences, perceptions may be very much real. Right? So that is extremely important from my point of view here, that indexicality is based on contiguity that is both material, maybe both material and or mental. Okay, so representaments that initiate semiosis in communication come from sensory perception of media products. Because in communication we always need something material to communicate with. One perceives configurations of sound, vision, touch, and so forth that are created or brought out by someone and understood to signify something. But from where do the objects come? They clearly do not emerge out of nothing, but are drawn forth from earlier percepts, sensations, and notions that are stored in memory, either in long-term memory or in short-term memory, which may also cover ongoing communication. So earlier may hence be a century ago or just a fraction, some fractions of a second ago. So the stored mental entities may be direct percepts from outside of communication. They may be interpretants from semiosis outside of communication. They may be interpretants from semiosis in earlier communication, or they may be interpretants from semiosis in ongoing communication. This is to say that objects of semiosis always require what Peirce calls collateral experience. In other words, collateral experience may both be formed by semiosis inside the spatiotemporal frame of the communicative act and stem from other earlier involvements with the world, including formal communication as well as direct experience of the surrounding existence. And in line with this twofold origin of collateral experience that renders semiotic objects possible, I distinguish between two utterly entwined but nevertheless dissimilar areas in the mind of the perceiver of media products: the intracommunicational and the extracommunicational domains, emphasizing hence a difference between the forming of cognitive import in ongoing communication, and what precedes and surrounds it. Consequently, there are both intracommunicational and extracommunicational indexical objects. As indices are grounded on real connections, they are equally important for the two domains. So, on the one hand, indices link entities in the intracommunicational domain to each other and thus establish, to some extent, establish coherence to some extent. Intracommunicational indices are, one might say, the glue of semiosis, preventing separate interpretants created in communication from falling apart in incomprehensible fragments. On the other hand, indices link entities in the intracommunicational domain to entities in the extracommunicational domain, and thus establish truthfulness of various sorts and degrees. Extracommunicational indices are the anchor of semiosis, preventing the interpretants of communication from drifting away from the extracommunicational domain. So indices keep communication together on the one hand, and on the other hand, keep it somehow fastened to what is out there. At least that is what I propose. All right, the extracommunicational domain should thus be understood as the background area in the mind of the perceiver of media products. It is constituted by everything that one is already familiar with. As it's a mental domain, it cannot be said to consist of the world as such. It is rather constituted by the world as one knows it, through perception and semiosis. The extracommunicational domain includes experiences of both what one presumes to be more objective states of affairs, such as dogs, universities, statistical relations, music, whatever you think of as something being out there independently of oneself, so to speak. But it also includes more subjective states of affairs, so states of mind related to individual experiences, what we feel, what we think, and so forth. Those are also part of what I call the extracommunicational domain, because it's something that we think that it is something that really exists. Although it's subjective and personal, it's there. And it's something that precedes communication. So the extracommunicational domain is thus actually formed in one's mind, not only through semiosis and immediate external perception, but also through interoception, proprioception, and mental introspection. I'm glad I'm in Greece, so you understand all the world. But I don't have to explain these interoception and proprioception and so forth. But I mean, the point here is that we shouldn't confuse what we perceive to be really existing, what is outside our skin, so to speak. Also, what we perceive in our own bodies and what we think and so forth are part of the reality as I conceptualize it here. Yes.
The schemata that we have.
Yeah.
As a grid of all our perceptions that is inside us, and this makes us perceive the outside world.
Yeah, and they are, as you suggest here, they are very connected in various ways too. So it's important not to make this harsh distinction between outside and inside. So the extra-communicational domain, as I understand it, includes perceptions from the outside and perceptions from the inside, and so on and so forth. Everything that we already have a collateral experience of, all things that we have already experienced and that we have somehow stored in our minds and bodies as memories and so forth. Okay, great. So it's important to note that vital parts of the extracommunicational domain are constituted by perception and interpretations of media products. Formal communication is thus very much part of what precedes and surrounds ongoing communication. Okay, so in contrast then to the extracommunicational domain, what I call the intracommunicational domain is the background, is the foreground area in the mind of the perceiver of media products. It's formed by one's perceptions and interpretations of the media products that are present in the ongoing act of communication. It's based on both extracommunicational objects emanating from the extracommunicational domain and intracommunicational objects arising in the intracommunicational domain. So the intracommunicational domain is what is being born, created, while communication is going on. As the intracommunicational domain is formed by communicative semiosis, it may be called a virtual sphere. And the virtual should not be understood in opposition to the actual, not at all, but as something having potential. I hence define a virtual sphere as a mental sphere created by communicative semiosis that has the potential to have real connections to the extracommunication. A virtual sphere can consist of anything from a brief thought triggered by a few spoken words, a gesture, or a quick glance at an advertisement, to a complex narrative or a scientific theory formed by hours of watching television or reading books or whatever. Now, the coexistence of intracommunicational and extracommunicational objects results in a possible double view on virtual spheres. From one point of view, they form self-ruled spheres with a certain degree of experienced autonomy. From another point of view, they are always exceedingly dependent on the extracommunicational domain, simply because we can't form things out of nothing. We always depend on our previous knowledge and experiences and so forth. So the crucial point here, to be made here, is that intracommunicational objects cannot be created ex nihilo. They are completely derived from extracommunicational objects. This is because nothing can actually be grasped in communication without the resource of extracommunicational objects. Without memories, without previous experience and so forth, we would be completely blank and it would be impossible to communicate or, well, understand anything. So even the most fanciful narratives require recognizable objects, objects that emerge from collateral experience in the extracommunicational domain in order to make sense. To be more precise then, intracommunicational objects are always in some way parts, combinations or blends of extracommunicational objects. So it's possible to represent, say, griffins because of one's acquaintance with extracommunicational material objects such as lions and eagles that can easily be combined. A virtual sphere may even include notions such as a round square, consisting of two mutually exclusive extracommunicational objects, together forming a very odd intracommunicational objects. It is possible to think about the round square. It may not exist, but it's possible to think about it. So also more purely extracommunicational objects may be modified or united into new mental intracommunicational objects. So objects such as familiar emotions may be combined into novel intercommunicational objects consisting of, say, conflicts between or blends of emotions that are perceived as unique and new in some way, although one is already acquainted with their components. So communication can create new things by way of combining, blending, and so forth, what is already known. The question then arises, if all communicational objects are ultimately derived from extracommunicational again. The question then arises, if all intracommunicational objects are ultimately derived from extracommunicational objects, how come that virtual spheres are often experienced as having a certain degree of autonomy? This is because they, in part or in whole, may be perceived as new gestalts, to borrow the German term. They can be perceived as new gestalts that disrupt the connection to the extracommunicational domain. This happens when one does not immediately recognize the new composites of extracommunicational objects. The reason for them not being recognized, not being recognized, not being cognized again, is that they have not earlier been cognized in the particular constellation in which they appear in the virtual sphere. All right, so here is then a visual diagram of what I've said so far, I think. So around everything, we have the unknown, and of which I say nothing. It's simply beyond what we can perceive. So I don't conceptualize this, and this means that what I'm trying to say here actually says nothing about how the world may actually be. We can just guess and hope that what we perceived around us somehow corresponds to what is actually there. But in the end, we cannot know, right? So what I'm talking about is the world as one knows it, through perception, semiosis, and so forth. And when we communicate, a new sphere is created in our minds. We read something, we watch at pictures, we talk, communicate through gestures or something, and then mental configurations arise, so thought, ideas, and so forth, and that I call then the intracommunicational domain. And that mental sphere, what I call the virtual sphere, arises in the perceiver of some media product on the basis, of course, of the specific characteristics, the traits of the media product. I mean, it makes a difference if I say one word or another, if I make one kind of image or another point, or another kind of image. But in the end, the meaning, or let's say the interpretants resulting from this, depend on our collateral experience, our previous knowledge, the background area in the mind, what surrounds and precedes the emerging virtual sphere. And the distinction that I make here is that on the one hand, we have collateral experience of what we have perceived more directly in the world, seeing mountains and streets and experiencing water and the texture of sand or whatever we perceive it, right? So the perceived actual sphere consisting of extracommunicational, immediate and presented material and mental objects. So when I say then immediate, it means that it is not mediated through communication. On the other hand, as human beings, we communicate a lot since we are born. So our collateral experience, the background area in the mind, is also very much constituted by earlier communication. So in our minds, we have stored not only percepts of the world as we perceive it, but also a lot of memories and experiences of earlier communication. So we have other virtual spheres stored in our minds. Everything we have all books we have read, communications we have had, images we have seen, gestures, interaction, all right. So those two spheres, the perceived actual sphere and the other virtual sphere, together form the background area in the mind, partly determining or at least directing how the perceived actual sphere is formed, because the perceived actual sphere always depends very much on this background area. And it gets even more complex when we consider then that, okay, so what about the other virtual spheres? Well, we have read something, we have heard something, and so forth. And when thinking about those earlier virtual spheres, they are, of course, then in their turn dependent on the communicator's perceived actual spheres and other virtual spheres. So in the end, it becomes very complex chains of virtual spheres building on virtual spheres, and so forth. And that's why it's so damn difficult to reach, well, let's say the truth or what really happened and so forth, because communication may be great, but it may also make things complicated, because in the end, you need to fall back somehow to some sort of perception of, well, what we perceive to be the external world. And that is why I think conceptualizations of truth and truthfulness that only rely on verbal language, they don't really have the capacity of finding this connection in the end to how truthfulness, for instance, is ultimately established. So it is language referring to language, and so forth. And that is why I think it's important to have a multimodal and intermediate view on all kinds of subjects, such as the one I'm talking about today. So some quick question regarding this before I move on. Crystal clear. Okay, sure.
If possible. Can I? This unknown area, it reminds me the alien text in Rodmanian semiotics. It is the same thing?
Sorry, I didn't hear because of my...
Yes, this unknown,
yes,
unknown, it reminds me the Rodmanian notion of the alien text. It's approximately the same thing.
The area in the text?
In the Tartu Moscow school, in Rodmanian semiotics, they speak about alien text.
Okay, okay.
It is approximately the same.
Yeah, I should mention that, of course, I hope nobody thinks that I think that I have invented all this from scratch, so to speak. Of course, this kind of conceptualization relates very much to a lot of, well, ideas, new and old and so forth. And perhaps I think that for many perceivers, perhaps the Kantian ideas about the world as such, and the world being, well, let's say, construed by minds perceiving space and time and so forth. So there are many ways of conceptualizing this, and I think that my model resonates with that. So I'm sure that I'm not that familiar exactly with the notion that you mentioned there, but I'm, as I said, I'm not the complete semiotician. I'm only a fragmentary semiotician, but I'm sure you're right, because this is such an old and important and extremely difficult thing to think about, right? Okay, so after this overview of the various spheres, we are in a position to further scrutinize the notion of indexicality, with greater emphasis on its core principle of contiguity and how it operates in relation to the intracommunicational and the extracommunicational. What are real connections on closer inspection? It is generally assumed that real connections consist of contiguity in space or time. As they must be understood in terms of both materiality and mind work, real connections can be established through concrete sensory perception of physical space and its temporal transformation, as well as through more abstract sensations of conceptual conceptual space and time. Given this sliding material mental scale, it's clear that real connections may be established also between entities that differ materially and mentally. So I suggest categorization on the one hand, general subclasses that can be discerned as different kinds of relations between entities, and on the other hand, specific subclasses that can be discerned as different kinds of relational channels between entities. And I'll explain this. So if we start with the general subclasses of contiguity, under the heading of general subclasses, we have contiguity in a weaker sense. So let's call it co-presence. Co-presence simply includes proximity, either in the sense of being adjacent, like person standing close to door, or in the sense of being part of, doorknob belonging to door, human body including hand, and so forth. So that is simply being present at the same time. We also have contiguity in a stronger sense, interaction. Interaction includes proximity and additionally some sort of, let's call it causality. Understood either as unidirectional, like person opening door, or reciprocal, person opening door that swings back and hits her in the head or something. So that is a stronger kind of contiguity, not only existing together, but somehow interacting also. So contiguity as co-presence and especially adjacency tends towards being more indirect, ambiguous, and subjective compared to contiguity as interaction. As everything can have some sort of spatiotemporal co-presence with almost anything, there's little point, I think, in classifying these weaker sorts of real connections. The specific subclasses that will be listed in a moment are therefore primarily applicable to contiguity understood as interaction. These sorts of real connections tend to be relatively direct, unambiguous, and intersubjective, relatively direct, unambiguous, and intersubjective, although they are by no means independent of the human perspective on the events of the world. So now to the specific subclasses of contiguity. The following list of various kinds of relational channels between entities is in no way complete, and there are no clear borders between the categories. The classification is merely intended to give a broad overview of the phenomenon of real connections by way of illuminating examples ranging from material to mental contiguity. So first, contiguity that does not include mental activities in the relational channel between entities embraces mechanical contiguity between finger and fingerprint, between bow being drawn across strings and violin sounding. Electromagnetic contiguity between photons emitted from matter and digital photographs, between input in computers and what is seen on the computer screens. Chemical contiguity between photons emitted from matter and classical photographs, between added heat and boiling water, and organic contiguity, like between disease and observable symptoms, between dead animal and fossil. Different kinds of real connections. Contiguity that includes corporeal and conscious or unconscious mental activities in the relational channel between entities holds, for instance, the combination of mental and mechanical contiguity, like between decision to use a pencil and written text. First we think, and then we do something mechanical. Between sudden rage and the smashing of a window. And it can also be the combination of mental and organic contiguity, like between an emotional state and the voice quality. When you get mad, you sort of... So something mental happens that really causes something that you do with your body, like changing your voice. Or between facial expression, or between emotional state and facial expression, body posture, and so forth. Finally, there's contiguity that consists of conscious or unconscious mental activities in the relational channel between entities. Like, sorry, I'll take that again. Finally, there's contiguity that consists of conscious or unconscious mental activities in the relational channel between entities, like between sensations and assumptions, between premises and conclusions, and so forth. Then we are in the area of real connections that is more or less disconnected from the outside world, so to speak. We have real relations when thinking. So all these general and specific subclasses of contiguity are relevant for understanding how both extracommunicational and intracommunicational objects become part of virtual spheres, I argue. It should be remembered, though, that even indices that build on real connections of the stronger kind, interaction, and that reach out to the perceived actual sphere, represent only the world as one knows it. Not only mental, but also mechanical, electromagnetic, chemical, and organic contiguity are actually presumed contiguities formed by collateral experience. The doctor observing a symptom cannot be absolutely sure that it's because of some certain kind of degrees. It's because of collateral experience that she assumes on good grounds that there is something really going on that causes the symptom. But in the end, it's because of collateral experience. Now, what do all these types of indices do in communication? My answer is that they generate internal coherence and external truthfulness. So, intracommunicational indexicality is semiosis creating bonds within a virtual sphere, connecting representaments on the ground of contiguity to objects that are drawn into or formed inside the virtual sphere as it evolves. The constituents of a virtual sphere are initially, when first being discerned, most certainly adjacent, and as perception and interpretation evolve, they are often also understood to be part of each other and to interact. As the mind strives for perceiving gestalts, one is deeply inclined to use these real connections as grounds for indices, which leads to chains and webs of representation that create coherence. Our minds want to form unities, as you know in the Gestalt psychological principles. That is how we have evolved in time. If we didn't see things as interrelated, we would not survive, simply. So, to repeat then, as the mind strives for perceiving gestalts, one is deeply inclined to use these real connections as grounds for indices, which leads to chains and webs of representation that create coherence. All right. So if communication goes forward and makes sense, its constituents are contiguous in a stronger sense, and indexicality based on causality rather than simply adjacency may result, which leads to an even stronger sense of coherence if communication works. It doesn't always. So internal coherence in communication may hence be defined as real connections between intracommunicational representaments and objects. Examples of internal coherence are: represented persons and actions appear to be generally interrelated. events and moods seem to somehow follow from another rather than occur randomly. Details are apprehended as parts of discernible mental or material wholes. Psychological states, ideas, and concepts are developed intelligibly. Physical properties are associated to material items in a consistent way. Physical and psychological actions lead to reactions that are linked to the actions, and so on and so forth. Only a few examples. Indexical junctions like these, based on various sorts of contiguity, occur in all kinds of media products, whether they consist of a limited amount of material, spatiotemporal, sensorial, and semiotic modes, such as still images or written texts, or are markedly multimodal, such as movies that are both spatial and temporal, both visual and auditory, and both decidedly iconic and symbolic. So, an important role of intracommunicational indexicality is hence to knit together the different modes of a media product through cross-modal representation, so that an integrated virtual sphere, rather than a set of unrelated, mode-specific mental spheres can be created. So we always put things together. We hear things, we see things, we sense things, and our minds work so that they are formed together, and they may refer to each other, represent each other. So multimodality would not be possible without these indices, I argue, that bind the different modes together. In contrast, then, extracommunicational indexicality is semiosis creating bonds between a virtual sphere and its surroundings, connecting representaments on the ground of contiguity to objects from outside the virtual sphere. I suggest this is equivalent to what I call external truthfulness. So, external truthfulness in communication may hence be defined as real connections between intracommunicational representaments and extracommunicational objects. Things in the ongoing communication refers to, represents, connects to things out there in the perceived actual sphere. That is external truthfulness. So the notion of truthfulness that I propose is thus to be understood as a conceived communicative trait, not to be confused with truth, understood as a feature of the actual, never fully accessible world. However, truth may possibly be approached through accumulated truthful communication from different sources and the observation of effects of further action on the basis of conceived truthfulness. Truthfulness may be tested, so to speak. We may look at a map, okay, how do I go to Aristotle University? I came here, so apparently the perceived truthfulness of the map, well, it seemed to correspond quite well what was out there, if I'm really here, of course, and if you are here, and if we exist, and all those epistemological doubts. So truthfulness may be approached to possible truth, and we may test it, but nevertheless, communication is never definitely connected to the absolute reality or truth of what is out there. We can only try our way in different ways. So now we are not only coming close to where I will finish, but I will ask some final questions. So to what can communication be truthful, more precisely? So far, I have only presented ideas about how representaments can be connected to objects in which different ways, but what about the objects, the entities, the processes, the things that communication refer to, that they represent? So again, to what can communication be truthful, more precisely? I suggest that extracommunicational indexical objects can be classified in various ways, and each category corresponds to a certain kind of truthfulness. So I'm not happy with only talking about truthfulness in general, but I think we must talk about different variations of truthfulness. I will now give some examples of such forms of objects and truthfulness. Again, it's not a rigid classification, but rather an incomplete inventory of contrasting types that sometimes overlap, sometimes complement each other, and sometimes are in conflict. There's no neat way, I think, of putting all these complex things into boxes. But a few suggestions of how one can think about objects of truthfulness. So following the division of the extracommunicational domain into two parts, we may state that a virtual sphere can be truthful to objects in the perceived actual sphere or to objects in other virtual spheres. That is, to our notions of the surrounding world or to our acquaintance with earlier communication. So if someone lies, I can truthfully say that that person lied, and that is true because I refer to this act of communication, even though I refer to an act of lying. So truthfulness to the perceived actual world or to earlier communication, no matter what kind of status that earlier communication has. It's also the case that the virtual sphere can be truthful to objects that are material or to objects that are mental. And I think this is a very crucial and in a way self-evident but often neglected observations. There is truthfulness as to how the world, more material world is, and there is truthfulness about how mental states may be. So it may actually be truthful to saying that you are mad or you are happy. Right. Connecting to an age-old distinction of Aristotle, we can furthermore say that the virtual sphere can be truthful to objects that are more or less universal or to objects that are particular. Some variations of this distinction would be to say that the virtual sphere can be truthful to objects that are typical or atypical, permanent or temporary, and global or local. This could perhaps be understood as a sort of statistical view of truthfulness, having to do with probability and repeated contiguity in various environments and circumstances. In a related manner, a virtual sphere can be truthful to objects that are wholes or to objects that are details. Truthfulness in details does not guarantee a truthful whole, and a truthful whole may harbor untruthful details. This is truthfulness understood as perception of gestalts or particulars. A more complex way of sorting extracommunicational indexical objects is to say that a virtual sphere can be truthful to objects that have been manifested in the past, that are presently manifested, that are bound to be manifested in the future, or that may be manifested in the future. These latter forms of truthfulness certainly rely really heavily on mental contiguity. Now, in this context, it must also be noted that any material item can be drawn into the communicative act and become a media product interacting with other media products or creating highly multimodal media products. So in criminal trials, for instance, fingerprints and other pieces of evidence are framed in such a way that they communicate together with standard media types such as speech, written text, still images, movies, sound recordings, that media types that incorporate these alternative kinds of media products in order to create a virtual sphere based on strong contiguity to the perceived actual sphere. So in order to create stronger truthfulness in cases like this, it's not enough that someone says his fingerprint was found on the murder weapon, right? You also have to take the gun and use it as a media product, actually, so that the gun becomes part of what is being spoken of, shown, and so forth. So the gun actually becomes then a medium having a real connection with the outside world. And in that way, we can always use all kinds of things as media products. It's not only these standard things like talking, writing, gesturing, and so forth. I mean, if I'm in a bar or even here, it might be possible for me to do, if you presume that this is empty, right? I do like this, and then I communicate, please give me some more water. Right? So in that way, we take objects, we may take objects from everywhere, make them part of communication of complex multimodal media products. And those kinds of objects that are drawn into communication are often those that provide these kind of stronger indexical connection to the perceived actual spheres. So, to summarize, thus, all varieties of contiguity, all kinds of intracommunicational indexical junctions, and all types of extracommunicational indexical objects are relevant for external truthfulness in communication. This abundance of relevant factors demonstrates the complexity of forming coherent virtual spheres with real connections to the extracommunicational domain. And I stop here and I skip the parts that I said I would possibly skip, because including your questions and discussions, I've been talking for 1 hour now, so I think that is more than enough. Thank you for your attention. I would be happy to have some questions, comments, ideas.
No, I don't have a question.
Thank you.
I really like how you said, interrupted you, so sorry. What you said about recognize, because we come from the French department and we're into languages, so it is not just recognition, but it is cognition again. So it's,
yeah. I like this very word for the reason that you can use it in a way that really enhances the etymological background. Recognizing is about cognizing again, and for me this is a very important aspect of how communication works. It's about picking out things, and as I'm sure you have all experienced and read about in various contexts and so forth, this is the case both in perception of the perceived actual of the external world, so to speak, and in communication. It's what we have in our minds tend to come out in our perception, so to speak. So very, very often, if it's like dark outside, and if we have a cat as a pet and we see a shadow moving, we tend to think that, oh, I saw the cat, because that is what we expect. Those are the prefigurations, those are the cognitions that we already have in our minds. So also in these kinds of perceptions, we recognize things on the basis of ideas and what cognitive scientists call image schemes and so forth, right? And as in perception, that is also the case in communication. And that is why it's so difficult to communicate sometimes. Because if you don't find the common ground, really, you can say whatever you like. No matter, the other person will answer not to what one really says, but to what that person thinks one is saying. Because in the worst cases, in communication, you may be stuck in your collateral experience. You think you already know what is going to be communicated, so you're stuck in the background area, and you don't really take in the perceptions of what is really being said or communicated in other way. So the idea of collateral experience, background knowledge, and so forth, it's both absolutely essential, necessary phenomenon that we cannot escape, and it's also sometimes a curse because it makes it difficult to. It's more difficult to communicate new things, to make these combinations and blends of known objects in a way that it forms new gestalts. It's more difficult, but it is possible, of course, I hope.
Other questions? Yes?
How all this that we said today can be applied in media?
I think that what I have tried to emphasize here is that on the one hand, all kinds of media, thought understood as those entities that make communication possible, right? So those material configurations that we use, like when I use my body now, you can see some gestures that I do, you can hear the sounds that I create with my vocal cords. So my body and its extensions now constitute a media product or a collection of media products. You can read the text, and then the figures on the paper constitute a media product. You can watch the photographs there, and then they are media products. So my point is that all kinds of these media types, whether they are visual, auditory, tactile, or whether they are static or temporal and so forth, no matter what, they can all trigger indexicality. And the indexicality is then the basis for how we establish connections with the outside, so to speak. So this is then a framework for being able to think about truthfulness, not in media types in isolation, but actually a framework that incorporates all different kinds of media types. So.
When you said media, in my mind I had commercials like Instagram, those kind of things.
Yeah, it's a much more specific understanding of the notion of medium. So those kinds of modern digital media forms, yeah, they are kind of media types, and I think that they must be conceptualized on the same, well, within the same framework, so to speak, as, well, let's say older forms of media like written texts on paper, books and so forth, speech and all that. So I think that in order also to understand those new kinds of media types, like the digital social media and so forth, you must understand them in relation to all other kinds of media forms, because basically, no matter how many differences there are in ways of distributions and production and so forth, they all finally relay on basic principles that can be conceptualized in a broad frame, right? So, yeah.
And one last.
Yeah, sure.
Can the new social kind of media that you mentioned, the Instagram...
Sorry, one more time.
Can the Instagram, all those modern kind of communication can be considered a link between the internal and the external?
Well,
because I'm sorry. You said that the thoughts, the personal thoughts that we have, we communicate them outside, and I'm guessing that the modern media form or a method that help us.
I would say that if you want to understand communication in those modern social media types, we must, there is no difference in principle between these kinds of communicative forms and the kind of communication we do right now here. So in both cases, it's about, on the one hand, having this collateral experience, knowledge, experiences, expectations, and so forth. That is the case whether you talk with me, or if you write a letter to your parents, or if you communicate with friends on Facebook and so forth. It's the same for everybody in all these cases. We have these perceptions and the experiences of earlier communication. They form the background area, and in both cases, it often really doesn't matter if the text is digitally produced on the screen or if it's printed on the paper and so forth. If we see a photo on the screen or a photo printed in a journal and so forth, because in both cases, of course, there are differences. It would be foolish to deny it, but nevertheless, the very basic principles consist of the perceiving sensory configurations, more or less. So in the case of photographs and paintings, we perceive certain visual configurations, and in our minds they correspond to known things. So we know how a face looks like. So if you see dot, 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 line, like something like that, it represents for us whether we want it or not. Oh, it's a face. And this example is not a random example, because it's actually the first thing, one of the first mental capacities that arise in babies. Perhaps it's even with us in the genes. We don't really know, but all small infants recognize faces, right? So we perceive these similarities, and we recognize a face when we see it here. We recognize it when we see it on the screen. We recognize it if we paint it, and so forth. And there are many animals that recognize these things. So dogs, for instance, have a tremendous capacity of not only recognizing human faces, but also recognizing when happy human faces, sad human faces, and so forth. And that capacity we have because we perceive the similarities. We have an experience of, if we have experienced 10 happy persons, we know how the facial expression corresponds to certain kinds of behavior. And if we have seen 10 angry faces, we associate this with, through indexes, right, to a certain kind of behavior, like being violent and so forth. So through statistical inferences, so to speak, we create the collateral experience of how, to continue the examples of the face, how they look, right? And then we perceive the similarities. So how does this person look like now? Or how does the person on the photo look like now? We perceive the similarity. And that is a kind of very basic cognitive ability that goes all over the area of media. So then in those cases, the digital or the analog way of producing communication is of very little relevance, I would argue, because it's still the same basic things. So that is why I keep arguing that I want this to be a model of communication at large, including all kinds of media types, old and new, artistic, non-artistic, well-developed, casual. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay. From what I understand from your talk, in order to the basis of truthfulness and coherence is the use of indices, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And you mentioned, for example, fingerprints used in trials. Supposedly, the use of DNA as proof for trials went under many changes about, let's say, supposedly, if you found a sample of a DNA of somebody, then there was no chance that it could belong to someone else. Then they found that, okay, maybe there is a very small chance, but it exists, so they need to change let's say, the examination in order for it to be better. So, what is your opinion about what makes a good index?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah, good. So, it's a good question, and it relates quite a lot to the many debates over the year concerning, well, truthfulness in photographs, and especially after the advent of digital photography, when it's becoming more and more easy to create photographs, if we still want to call them photographs. It's an open question, right? Because the traditional notion of photograph was formed when the images were created in a particular way where it was more difficult to manipulate the process, so to speak. Well, I guess that my answer is more or less a repetition of what I've said constantly about this perceived external sphere. So the truth, the world as such, that is beyond what is possible to conceptualize, I think. I mentioned the example of the medical doctor observing a symptom, right? And through collateral experience, she deduces that, okay, this person is sick in this and that way because I've seen so many persons behaving and reacting in exactly this way, so I conclude that it's most likely a real connection between these symptoms and what goes on inside the body. So the medical doctor then forms in her mind an index based on perceived real connection. So we have to come back to what I said initially here about science not being something existing out there, but something being formed in a mental process. So even if indices are based on real connections, it's only these real connections are always perceived real connections. And I think I would say that, well, the strongest indices or the best indices, I think they must lean towards the scale of, well, what I talked about, these general types of real connections. So starting with only co-presence, well, that is not a very strong relation. Something, as I said, anything can be adjacent to just about anything. My shoe happened to be here right now and the picture on the wall is there. Well, in a way, yes, there is a spatial temporal contiguity here, but one may also say that, well, my shoe and the picture there, they just happen to be here, that they don't interact. So real connections consisting of interactions. Not only actions, but interactions, as I took the example of someone opens the door and the door swings back and so forth. So the more interaction, the more complex form of contiguity you have. the more unlikely it becomes that these events are only coincidences, right? So it's a coincidence that my shoe is here and that one is there, but if I start to manipulate with this, or it was not a coincidence that I broke the lamp, for instance, because I messed with it, I wanted to have some more light, and I broke it. So that was a result of a more complex interaction, so to speak, moving around, doing things, and so forth. So then one may conclude, well, probably the lamp didn't broke just by itself. It's very likely that someone messed around with it. So I think that my answer to that question comes rather close to how people work within the legal system, actually. You need as many pieces of evidence as possible. The more pieces you put together, the more kinds of events, details, processes that are very likely to be results of interactions that have really occurred in various ways, the more probably it is that, no, this is not a coincidence. It's something that might even be true. At least we perceive the communicative objects to be truthful. And the more truthful communicative semiotics events you have, the more likely it is. And as you said about these DNA traces, again, we can never be sure. I mean, what can one conclude if we find a DNA sequence? Well, the strongest index to be formed out of such a finding might be, perhaps, not being an expert in this area, but something like, okay, so this piece of tissue or whatever comes from a human being. So unless I know there are methods for creating artificial tissues, and you can manipulate cells and all forms of thing, right? So, but the strongest conclusion is probably that, okay, this DNA must come from some person, or it's derived from something being artificially produced on the basis of something that was once human, like a stem cell or something like that, right? So that's the conclusion. But it requires another step in the chain towards coming as close to the truth as possible. And that is, of course, then, okay, so we found this piece of DNA here. It must be from some human, we conclude. And are we sure about what human that is? And once upon a time, yes, you were more sure about it. But you thought you were more sure. But now, as you suggested here, more and more knowledge pops up about DNA actually being possibly very, very similar in different persons. I think there are some very, very rare kinds of persons are called chimeras or something like that. And they actually have a DNA that is partly exactly the same as from other persons. So with increased knowledge, we can then reduce the indexical interpretations, so to speak. I mean, the collateral experience says to us that, okay, it's human DNA and it looks like that, but now we know that that kind of DNA may come from different persons. And because of that collateral experience, we then think that, no, this is not a strong, real connection in that direction. No, it's not. And another possible question is, of course, all right, suppose that we can establish that this piece of tissue with a certain kind of DNA absolutely sure comes from a certain person. All right? So then we can conclude that this is a strong index, this DNA comes from that person. But that is not the same as saying that person was here. That is another question. That requires another semiotic link, so to speak. We must also think about, okay, so how did this piece of DNA come here? So, I mean, this is, we've all seen it on detective stories and police stories in the TV, you know, someone takes a piece of hair or something from one person, plants it on the crime, on the scene, the crime scene. And then we have, okay, so the hair is still an index for that person, but it's not necessarily a strong index for that person having been actually there. So one possible answer to your question is then that we must go further than I could possibly do here today, talking about, you know, simple indices. In the end, there are always very complex chains of semiosis and different stages of indices that must be put together, so to speak, in order to make it work. So. Okay, sorry for the long answer. Interesting question and things that I've been thinking about really much. So.
Thank you. It was quite an interesting talk, a speech.
Thank you.
Allow me, if you please, to lay down on this table my own experience from this particular speech. Well, I come from a different field of studies, a different field of interest. So I am in metaphraseology, and I'm into audiovisual translation. So I've got plenty of multimodality there. So, but semiotics is deep waters for me. Now, on the basis of communication, listening to what you say comes to me as a totally new vocabulary, because the language translators use in this kind of multimodality and communication is totally different. So all this information you gave us was something like to be translated by me in order to be understood. So let me say that if we take the quote that beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, then the truth lies in the mind of the beholder. And the truth for me was a totally different case in this particular speech. But I really got what I needed to understand different things in a different way from the usual sense.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear, and I really appreciate your example here of the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So truthfulness is in the eye of the beholder. I would then say so, or in the mind. Yeah, certainly. So if we dare to think still about truth, then it is out there, out of reach for us. But when we think about what might be actually out there or in here, it's surely about, well, it's semiosis, you know. Interpretance. That's all we can do. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm acutely aware of this, well, let's call it the terminological problem, because as soon as you come into, well, let's say important issues, I think this is an extremely important issue. I mean, what could be more important than thinking about how to be able to understand truthfulness in communication? I think it's extremely important and extremely difficult, and especially if you want to incorporate all kinds of communication like I do, you must start on a very abstract level, and that is of course why I have to, well, partly invent and partly redefine terms, because if you simply take all the existing terms, they have so many associations that will lead you in slightly wrong directions and so forth. So even if it's painful and sometimes boring and tiresome and so forth. You sometimes have to go through this process of redefining and adjusting terms and so forth to get it the way you want it, so to speak. But it was very, very difficult. When I wrote about this the first time, I thought so much about what word should I use. So I finally thought, okay, truthfulness. And then when you look in the dictionaries, of course, you find that they mean all kinds of things that can lead your mind astray, so it's so easy to be misunderstood, right? But I nevertheless think it's a term that comes closest to the idea of perceiving something in communication as reaching towards what is really there somehow. So, yeah.
For instance, in French semiotics, we say synergy of semiotic systems. I think it's the same thing that you say interaction. Is it?
Perhaps. I'm not sure. But, yeah. I can't remember any term that I use that is self-evident, so to speak. I mean, in the area, if you work with intermediality, so a term such as medium, it refers to not only many different notions, it refers to hundreds, thousands of notions. Because in the world, everything is somehow in the middle of something else, or in between something else. So if you go to different scientific areas or even ordinary language, a medium can be just about anything. So, and then there is no point whatsoever to invent a new word. You have to use the existing terms. Medium means then being in the middle, in between, and so forth. And then you have to define. So what is this kind of medium in between? And then I postulate that, well, the kind of medium that I refer to is the thing that is in between at least two minds, making communication, interaction between these minds possible. So, yeah, postulate, define the old scientific methods. What can you do? Interaction is equally complicated, of course. It can be just about anything. But, okay.
Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. I also do not have a background in semiotics, mostly in cultural studies and literary studies. My question has to do with the impact of memory, and if memory contributes towards truthfulness, if it allows us to reach it, or if it hinders us from actually reaching it, due to instances of distorted memory, factors of age, mental disorders?
It's also a very good question. And I think that, well, in one of the parts that I decided to skip, I reasoned a little bit about well, communicators, communicating minds, those that produce the media product, like me now talking. So the producer's mind is, to some extent, not only relevant but vital for truthfulness, because as long as we stick to the notion that many people actually do remember things correctly, as long as we stick to that notion, it's hard not to value memories as real connections to things going on. And that is also one of the foundational parts of legal systems, right? Witnesses. I was there, I saw it, I could feel it, and I remember it. So memories obviously then go under the heading of, well, what I would then in my lingo call a mental contiguity. Memories being traces of actual perceptions of things. And then we come to the difficult part that you mentioned, and that science now more and more knows also about. Not only that we can have memories based on perceptions that were actually distorted, so to speak. I mean, we can, to take the example of the cat again, we are absolutely sure about seeing the cat there in the dark, because our collateral experience at the moment made it inevitable for us to draw that conclusion, so to speak. So we can have a process of perception, creating the awareness of something like the cat in the bushes, and that experience of really perceiving or really thinking that one perceives the cat. We can have memories of that, and in a way then that memory is correct, it's adequate, because we really thought we saw the cat. So we can have a real memory of, yes, I'm absolutely sure I saw the cat. The problem then is only that, yeah, you saw the cat, but it wasn't there, because it was a perception based on inferences of the mind, those kinds of inferences that make it possible for us, well, through evolution, to react quickly. Because if it's not a cat, but a lion, we have to immediately conclude that it's a lion, and then we run, or then we kill it if we are brave, or whatever. So that is how our minds work, based on let's call it distorted perception. It's not really good to say distorted perception, because neuroscientists are, I think most neuroscientists agree that perception is always a construction somehow. So there is no such thing as actually perceiving exactly what is out there. It's always a process of putting a lot of separate sensory details together, so to speak. So already in the perception of the external world, the mind is working according to the Gestalt principle, wanting us to perceive whole things that belong together, and so forth. So we can have true memories, truthful memories about what we actually perceived, but a perception that did not actually correspond to what is out there. On the other hand, we can have actual memories that actually correspond to what we have actually perceived, but then things happen in the brain, as you said. Age sometimes, illness sometimes, but also as a normal part of how our minds actually work. I mean, our brains are apparently designed in such a way that, well, evolution wants them to be efficient, so to speak. So that is quite natural. Things disappear, new memories replace old ones, and so forth. And in the area of witness psychology, we are now also acutely aware of the mad fact that false memories can be created if you either consciously or unconsciously interrogate a person suspected for some crime. Yeah, we know now that you can create false memories, because that's how the mind works. And then we come to the point where we again really have to emphasize perceived, actual connections, because memories can be false, they can be manipulated even, they can become more untrustworthy, and so forth. So in the end, the epistemological question will always remain: how will we eventually reach what's actually happened and so forth. And we can never. We can only. So another way of answering that question is then, okay, so memories can be deranged in various ways. So what do they do in the court then? Well, let's call in another witness, and another one, and another one. And in that way you can delimit the, well, make the margins more narrow, so to speak. And in the end, if everybody on the planet Earth remember wrongly, well, let's then hope that we will live happily together forever in our false world. Yeah, perhaps. Thank you very much.
Any other question? No? Thank you very much, Professor Elleström, for participating in Aristotle University of Thessaloniki SemioLab Open Lecture, and I hope to see you very soon again in Greece. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.